We have a new camera mount because I had some complaints about grinding noise on my videos. Now Mr. Stith has offered to simulate grinding noises, and I thank you not to do that, Mr. Stith. Okay, so let's get started. If I am correct, this is where we left off. Is that right? You don't know about that. Let's figure it out.
Goes backwards. Wait, never mind. I like it.
This is it? Okay. Okay, so we haven't talked about this one here, so here we go. We're going to talk now about unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. So in conventional cash flows, you only have one sign change. You have all the investment followed by all the positive cash flows. Now, it doesn't just have to be the first one that's negative and then the rest positive. You could have 3 years, 7 years, whatever, of negative cash flows, and then it turns positive. As long as you only have one sign change, then you will only have one IRR. Does anyone remember the definition of IRR? Yeah, oh, for shame, you're late. It's the discount rate that makes NPV equal to 0. And it turns out if you have more than one sign change, you're going to have more than one discount rate that makes NPV equal to 0. So let's talk about how you end up with cash flows like this. This is kind of crazy looking, but in truth, in the real world, this does occur. Well, let's talk about coal mining. In the United States, the way we do coal mining is we knock the top off of a mountain. That's a huge negative cash flow to knock the top off the mountain. Then we scoop the coal out over the life of the mine. Those are positive cash flows every year. And then at the end of the mine's life, here's the crazy thing. The government makes us rebuild the mountain. Now, knocking the top off was easy compared to building the mountain because gravity helped us the first time. And it's working against us the second time. So it's very expensive to rebuild a mountain. And so you have negative cash flows and you follow by positive and then a huge negative cash flow at the end. One that we see more often, gasoline stations. When you build a gasoline station in a convenience store, the gasoline is stored in tanks under the ground. And then you build the gas station on top of it. But when it comes time to end that project, the government makes you go in there and dig up the old tanks. Any idea why they make you dig up the old tanks?
Why?
Say again? Yeah, keep in mind the tanks are made of carbon steel. Carbon steel corrodes over time. We'll put a sacrificial anode on that or whatever, but it's still going to, over time, it's reading my gestures. Stop that. Glad I read the instructions. Okay, now back to the story. You got to dig up the tanks. Over time will corrode, and then they will leak. And when they leak, then the gasoline or whatever's left in that tank may contaminate the water table. So, what does the government make you do? It makes you dig up the tanks, and then makes you scoop out the soil from around the tanks. Why do you think they make you scoop out the soil from around the tanks? Yeah, so there's probably gasoline in that soil if that tank has leaked. They make you scoop that out, and then they make you send it off to an incinerator, then they make you come back and fill that hole in, and then you're done. So you've got this negative cash flow up front when you build the station. You've got positive cash flows, we hope, throughout the station's life. And then at the very end, you have a huge negative cash flow as you clean up the place. So, my point in telling you those two examples is so that you know these things actually exist. You got to keep an eye out for them. And what we're going to show you is that IRR is not a good tool for this. So get your calculator out. And we're going to say CF, second, clear work. So here our cash flows are horizontal instead of vertical. Don't let that freak you out. What should I put in for CF0? Wow, 100, negative, enter, arrow down. What do I put in for C01? 230. Enter, arrow down. What's F01? 1. 1, because that cash flow only happens once. C02, yeah, 132, negative, enter. Now, what button should I hit to calculate IRR? Yeah, the IRR button, and then what do I have to do? Compute, very good. Okay, so it's given me 10%, and we said that we can test that by going to NPV, put in 10%, hit enter, arrow down. What should it be when I compute this? It should be 0, right? And it is. Now this little star tells you, hey, that's something I computed. And so this actually does come out really, it comes out perfectly 0. But here's what I want to show you. There is another IRR at 20, enter. 20, enter, arrow down, compute. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with scientific notation, this is minus 5 times 10 to the negative 13th power. So here's what that is. It's 0.0, let's see, I'm going to do it from your perspective. It's 0.000000000000000 0 and then 5. Can we agree that that's like 0? Given that 0.01 would be 1 cent, I think we can agree that that's also 0. Now, here's the problem. The calculator, if we go back and click on IRR, and we hit compute, it gives us 10%, which is a correct IRR, but you think maybe if I just hit the down arrow key, it'll give me that 20%. Nope. Maybe up arrow key. Nope. There is no way to get your calculator to confess the IRRs that happen after the first one it finds. Because the calculator is lazy. It just gets to one and it's like, whoop, I found it, and it stops. Now, how do you find the other IRRs? When we are inside Excel for Chapter 8, I will show you how we can go about finding where the other IRRs are at. For right now, it suffices to know that there's going to be more than one anytime we have more than one sign change. And in fact, if we've got 2 sign changes, we're going to have 2 IRRs. Any idea what happens if we have 3 sign changes? 3 IRRs. What if we have 7 sign changes? 7 IRRs. Okay, now let's take a look at the net present value profile. And what we've got here is NPV on the vertical axis, and we've got the discount rate on the horizontal axis. So so the IRR rule says if the IRR is greater than the discount rate, we accept. Is that correct? Let me say that one more time. If the IRR is greater than the discount rate, then we accept. Okay, so if we have a discount rate of 8%, what's our NPV going to be there? Do you see on the picture? It's negative, right? But the discount rate there is 10%. Our IRR, our IRR is 10%. Our discount rate is 8%. What does the rule tell us? It tells us to accept the project, right? If the discount rate is greater than the IRR, then if the IRR is greater than the discount rate, then we accept. Well, if our discount rate here is 8% and we've got an IRR of 10%, that tells us to accept it. But would that be a good decision? No, because the NPV is negative. Now, let's go and say that the discount rate's actually 12% and our IRR is 10%. IRR is less than the discount rate, therefore the rule says that we should reject it. However, what do we see is true about the NPV at 12%? It's positive. If we have a positive NPV, should we accept or reject? Yeah, we should accept. And so, long story short, if you see unconventional or non-conventional cash flows, do not use IRR. Do not use IRR. Always use NPV. If you have mutually exclusive projects, do not use IRR. Always use NPV. Two situations in which you absolutely need to use NPV instead of IRR. Mutually exclusive projects, and when we have unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. Questions? Okay, so we've determined that there are some issues with IRR, and we've said that it requires the same stuff to create as NPV. So you might think I'm going to lead into a meatloaf thing here, but I'm not. And here's why. It sums up a project with a single number that most people have an intuitive feel for. Now let's ask why that's important. Who do you think ends up being the CEO at the firm? Do you think it's a finance person? Who's more likely, the finance person or the marketing person? Oh, come on. Typically, we finance types are antisocial, right? Do those people typically get to be CEO? No. It's weird. The CEOs that I've known, if they met you once, they would remember your name. That was so freaky to run into them 2 years later and they remember your name. I mean, that's the kind of sociable people we're talking about. That's not me. That's probably not you. But marketing people and sales people, they tend to be along those kind of lines that allow them to rise to those levels of power in the company. Now, why is that important here? Do you think marketing people are going to remember anything about NPV when they're 20, 30 years from now, they're CEO? Absolutely not. And so they will, though, know that they've got a mortgage that is currently at 3.375%. They'll know they've got a CD down at the bank that's 4%. They'll know they've got a home, a car loan that's 7 or 8%. And they'll know that they expect around 12% return on their retirement. So they have these numbers in their head. And so if you go to them and you say the IRR on this project is 17%, does that sound good or bad to them? That sounds good. Now, this is dangerous though. The only time you want to play that card is if it's a positive NPV project. So what we've got is we have figured out that this is actually a good project, and then we can sell it to the leadership using the IRR. What if it's a negative NPV project with an IRR of 27%? Yeah, you say this is really a bad idea. It's going to destroy shareholder wealth. And then you might say, by the way, to the tune of like $5 million, this is a bad idea. But when you talk about when you're selling them a project and it's got a high IRR and a high positive NPV, feel free to just tell them the IRR. Same way when it's a really dismal IRR and the NPV is negative, you can say, look, the IRR on this thing is only 2%, right? We could do better than that down at the bank. Does that make sense? By the way, do you think our project's safer than putting money in the bank? Probably not. Probably not. So in other words, the discount rate's going to have to be higher than 2%. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is if the IRR is high enough, we might not even need to know what that appropriate discount rate is. We could skip over chapter 12 entirely because, here's a crazy example. What if the IRR on replacing the company pickup truck is 45%? Do we really need to know whether that discount rate is 7%, 11%, or even 20%? No. The chances of the true discount rate for that pickup truck are going to be greater than 45%, damn near zero, unless we're in like one of those countries like Zimbabwe or Argentina where the inflation's just through the roof. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we're on to the Profitability Index. If you think back to what I told you the book's definition of NPV is, it is the present value of the cash flow subsequent to initial investment. What does subsequent to mean? After. It's the present value of the cash flows after initial investment minus the initial investment. Now, of course, that definition assumes all investment happens at time 0, right? We can rearrange that formula to get the present value of cash flow subsequent to initial investment by itself, and that's going to be helpful. And here's why. Because profitability index is the present value of those cash flows subsequent to initial investment divided by the initial investment. Now I want you to write this down very, very carefully. The initial investment here is positive. The initial investment here is positive. The initial investment in this formula is positive. It's got to be positive. If you put it in as negative, you will always get exactly the wrong answer. You'll always get the flip side. So you want to put in the initial investment as positive. So we can rearrange our NPV formula to come up with the initial investment plus NPV is substitutable equal to the present value of cash flows subsequent to the initial investment. And so we're just going to pop that in there. And then when I do the division out, I've got initial investment over initial investment plus NPV over initial investment. What happens to initial investment over initial investment? Yeah, it cancels out, becomes 1, right? And so what we're really talking about here is that PI is equal to 1 plus the NPV divided by the initial investment. And then we can use our NPV rule to figure out what the PI rule should be. I only accept positive NPV projects. If I put a positive number in here for NPV, is this thing going to be greater than or less than 1? It's got to be greater than, right? So if I put, assuming I don't screw up this and put negative initial investment in there, right? If I put the positive initial investment in like I'm supposed to, then anytime I have a positive NPV, I will have a PI greater than 1. And so that's our decision rule. We accept projects with PI greater than 1. And you say, well, wait a minute, we already had the NPV, therefore we knew we would accept this project before we even did PI. And so there has to be some other reason that we're doing PI. What do we need for PI? Well, you might be able to guess. It's exactly the same things that we need for NPV. You've got 1 plus NPV over the initial investment. So we got to calculate NPV, and you needed initial investment to do that. And so it's exactly the same ingredients. Let's ask ourselves the questions, the 3 questions about this investment rule. Number 1, does it account for the time value of money? Yeah, it's got NPV in it, right? Number 2, does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows? Mr. North?
I'm going to say no.
Oh, swing and a miss. Oh, you could be CEO. Okay, so here's the trick. Remember, it's got NPV in it, and we said NPV did account for the risk. Why did we say NPV accounts for the risk? How does NPV account for the risk? Yeah, it's the discount rate. Remember, it's a discount rate appropriate to the risk of the cash flows. And since we're using NPV to make this thing, therefore we have accounted for the riskiness. Now let's get to the 3rd question. Does it give us any information regarding the wealth created by the project? Okay, so yes, it does. Does anyone want to have a no on this one? It turns out this one's kind of like IRR. I would accept either answer here, and here's why. Profitability index, if it's greater than 1, lets us know that we are creating wealth. But does it tell us how much? No, it doesn't. And so it's just like IRR in that sense. It tells us whether or not we're creating wealth, but it doesn't tell us how much. So, how many stars did we give IRR? 2.5. How many stars are we going to give this thing? 2.5. Same. It's going to be exactly the same. Okay, so when is PI really useful? First of all, we'll say during times of capital rationing. In fact, this is the only reason that we're really interested in this, is capital rationing. What's rationing? You and your friends go for a cruise on spring break. The boat sinks. You're stuck on a lifeboat together. You don't know how long it's going to be, but you've got this thing of water, and you've got these little protein bars that are standard in every life raft. Do you eat them all at once? Would you like to eat them all at once? Of course, right? They're tasty. But instead you have to ration those things, so you're not getting as much as you want. When we talk about capital rationing, what we're talking about is that you cannot get enough capital to accept all the positive NPV projects. You can't get enough capital to accept all your positive NPV projects. And so this is very similar to when we talked about how payback was useful. If you've got a startup firm, by the way, do you think people in rational times just shower startups with money? No. Now, we do have bubbles where people will do stupid things, and so the dot-com boom, and then we had another one here recently. But it's really hard now to get money for maybe a startup. So what do? Well, you go out there and you try to figure out the projects that are going to give you the biggest bang for the buck. And that's where Profitability Index comes in. So let's tell you the method here. First of all, we're going to go through every single project, and we are going to calculate NPV, and then we're going to use that information to calculate PI. And then we are going to sort our projects by descending Profitability Index. What does descending mean? Yeah, from biggest to smallest, right? And so that's the way we're going to go through these projects. And we are going to accept projects until we run out of money. Let me give you some examples here. So we've got project A, B, C, D. And we have the Profitability Index, and then we have the cost to invest in each one of these things. So this one's going to be 3.7, this one's going to be 3.2, this one's going to be 2.4, and this one's going to be 1.7. Are all of these projects acceptable? Yeah, they're all acceptable. They all have positive NPVs. If we could get all the money, if we had all the money we needed, what would we do? We'd invest in them all. But the problem here is we only have $1 million to invest. This first project costs $400,000. What do? We accept or reject? Yeah, we accept it. How much money do I have left now? 600,000. And this next one is 300,000. Do I accept or reject? I accept it. How much money do I have left? 300,000. This one costs $500,000. What do? What do? Yeah, I gotta reject it. Why? I don't have enough money, right? And this one just so turns out that it's exactly 300,000. Do we accept it or do we reject it? Yeah, we accept it. And then, how much money do we have left? 0. So now it's time to get busy starting to implement projects A, B, and D. Now, do I look at project C and say, oh, damn it, and I just throw it out? No, what can I do? Do you think there might be more money down the road? Yeah. So you just put that one in your hip pocket and you wait till you get some money together. Maybe you get another investor. Maybe they invest $500,000 and you say, poof, I know exactly what we're going to do with that money. By the way, do you think every company that goes out there and raises money from venture capitalists and all that, do you think they all know exactly what they're going to do with the money? No. And do you think all venture capitalists are smart enough to spot that? No. And so you end up with, who was that guy that was running WeWork? You guys know who I'm talking about? Oh my goodness. So there was a movie about him. You could go out and Google WeWork. Adam Neumann, I think was his name. Had no freaking clue. Was selling so these co-working spaces, it's basically just renting office space, right? And he's pitching it to venture capitalists as if it's a tech company. And the idiots bought into it, and they showered him with cash. And as a result, they drank really good tequila in the office all day long. What do you think that does to the business, by the way, when people drink tequila all day long? Do you think that's a positive? No. Okay. So now when we talk about startup firms, but we also should talk about something our federal government does. Do you guys know what FEMA is? What's FEMA? Yeah, it's disaster relief, and it's a federal emergency management, and then I think it's administration, but it could be agency, I don't know. But if you have a hurricane, my wife and I moved to Mississippi right after Hurricane Katrina, and there were all these FEMA trailers there. They had brought in housing for people who had lost their homes. They would also bring in fresh water, and there were lots of things that they did to help people out after a disaster. But did you know that FEMA is also in the disaster prevention business? Can you prevent a hurricane? No. Can you prevent a tornado? No. Can you prevent a flood without building dams and stuff? No. But we can prevent flood damage. And so and let me tell you how that works. Where is it most likely to flood? Say again? Near a river, right? By the way, where do people like to build their vacation homes? Near the water, right? They're like, yeah, I like to be able to fish off my back porch, right? Now, here's the problem. Our silly government, when places get flooded out, by the way, they subsidize this flood insurance, right? So when people get flooded out, what happens? The government says, oh, Mr. Stith, I'm so sorry that your home got flooded out. Here's some money. Pat you on the head. Now, what's Mr. Stith going to do? Where are you going to build your new home? By the water, right? So how do I keep Mr. Stith from doing that? I buy his home and his land. That's step number one. Step number two is I have to tear down the home. Any ideas why I have to tear down the home? I mean, it's flood damaged. Why do I have to tear it down? Mold, very good. What else?
So no one else buys it.
Okay, so no one else buys it. I like that, but now I'm buying the house, I'm buying the land, I'm going to put a sign on it that says property of the Federal Emergency Management Administration Agency, whatever it is. What happens to empty dwellings? Squatters. And you say, well, wait a minute, this is just unhoused people, housing challenged people, finding a place to stay. Isn't that great? Here's the problem. What do they do in these places? They do drugs, and not only do they do drugs, they cook drugs, right? And so then you end up with a toxic waste cleanup. Actually, I had a former student, he was a Greene County Sheriff's deputy, and the reason he left the force was because all these meth houses he was having to go, and not only did he have to raid, but then the sheriff's deputies were responsible for trying to clean that mess up, and it's freaking toxic, right? Okay, so the good news is most meth is not made around here anymore because it's just so cheap to bring it in from Mexico now. So you can rest easy that your neighbors probably aren't going to have a meth lab. Back to the story. So it's important to tear these things down. Now, every year Congress sets aside a certain amount of money to do this kind of work. And so there is the limit to the capital. And then what they do, FEMA puts out a request for proposals and asks for firms to, or just individuals, to identify these flood-prone structures and come up with a proposal for buying it and tearing it down. And so I actually had to sit, and the reason I know all this is one of my MBA students actually was an engineer, and his firm did these kinds of projects. And there was a restaurant down in Ozark that kept flooding out every time the Finley River would flood, and that was his project. And what they did was calculate, they go through the whole project, create it, and then they calculate the profitability index. And I have to imagine that they write it in the upper right-hand corner of the cover sheet. They write the profitability index, and off to Washington, D.C. it goes, where some intern sitting at a desk puts them in descending order with the highest PI at the top and going down. And then they do exactly what we did here. They go through that pile accepting projects until they run out of money. And so for the projects that don't get funded, they send out a nice letter that says, sorry, your project wasn't accepted this year. Please try again next year. Will it still be a good project next year? Yeah. Is there a chance that it'll get funded? Maybe Congress puts out twice as much money. Who knows, right? Getting money from the government in this country is like following behind an armored truck and just waiting for the bags to fall out. You just never know when it's going to happen. And when you see it, what do you got to do? Jump on it? Does that make sense? Okay. So that is how actually government uses profitability index also. Any questions about profitability index so far? Okay, now we're back at a thing that's caused us a problem before, and it's the mutually exclusive project. The mutually exclusive project. We're back to the snow cone stand and the nightclub. And if you remember correctly, the NPV for the snow cone stand was 24.34. Does that sound about right? 24.34. The NPV for the nightclub was something like 119.6 or something like that. Does that sound right? So go ahead and write those down. And now we're going to calculate the PI for both of those. Let's start with Project A. Project A, the PI would be 24.34 divided by 100, which would be 0.2434, plus 1. And so the PI there would be like 1.2434. You're trying to get back to where we were? I think you've blown past it.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. It was IRRs where we had that. Oh, we're getting close.
I found it.
Okay.
Thanks
So
for the help.
how much was the NPV? Oh man, I was off by just like a little bit. So we're looking at, yeah, NPV here. So we had 24.34 and we had 119.08. And so when I'm looking at the nightclub, I've got 119.08 divided by, what's the initial investment? 1,000. So it ends up with 0.11908. We add 1, and now we've got something like 1.119. So your PI there is 1.119. Now, if you were to make the decision based on PI alone, would you prefer to have 1.2434 or 1.119? Yeah, you'd rather have the first one, right? It's the exact same problem that we had for IRR and for the exact same reason. Remember we said that IRR doesn't care about the scale of the project? Neither does profitability index. And the reason it doesn't is because we divided by the initial investment, right? We divided by the initial investment. Therefore, it doesn't care about scale either. And so we end up with the exact same problem with profitability index as we do with IRR when it comes to mutually exclusive projects. We should never use PI for mutually exclusive projects. We should never use IRR for mutually exclusive projects. What should we do with mutually exclusive projects? NPV. NPV. Now, there is some good news here. And the good news is that PI does not have the same problem with multiple IRRs that IRR does. And the reason is it's using NPV. We use NPV to calculate PI. And remember, if we used NPV to make that decision back when we were looking at unconventional or non-conventional cash flows, then we would make the correct decision, even though it went in the face of the IRR rule. So, long story short, PI perfectly fine with unconventional or non-conventional cash flows, but it does give problems with mutually exclusive projects. So let's talk now about what goes on in the real world. So what these finance professors did is they did a survey of all sorts of businesses, and they broke those businesses down into two groups, large firms, small firms. I don't know what the cutoff was, but usually the way this works is we look at the median and we take the top half as being the large firms and the bottom half being the small firms. And what they did is they said on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being never and 4 being always, how often do you use the following things? And they asked them about these rules that we've been talking about. And the most popular ones come out to be IRR and NPV. And here's what I want you to notice. Look how close the ratings are. 3.41 versus 3.42 at large firms. 2.87 versus 2.83 at small firms. Basically, whenever these people are doing one, they're also doing the other. And there's a real easy, good reason for that. Once we have enough information to calculate NPV, it's very easy to calculate IRR. I will show you when we get into Excel. We're going to build out this whole project to find the NPV, and then it's going to take us about 12 seconds to figure out what the IRR is for that. And it's the same thing on your calculator. If you've got all the stuff in your calculator to do NPV, all you got to do is hit IRR compute, right? And we said that IRR has some value in being able to persuade the less financially literate. Let's put it a nice way, to persuade the less financially literate. Okay, now, we do see, though, that there is a difference. Large firms are more likely to use these two than small firms. Any idea why? I can think of a couple of good reasons. Any idea why, Mr. North?
Scale.
Okay, very good. At large companies, do you think it's possible they have larger projects? Yeah, absolutely. And so it might be worth putting $10,000, $20,000 into creating a net present value analysis versus the small firm whose projects are smaller. Another reason I can think of is when you go out and you hire your first financial professional at a firm. Is it a finance person or is it an accountant? Yeah, it's an accountant, because the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're paying our taxes correctly so we don't go to jail. And so it's possible that the financial thinkers at these small firms are more likely to be accountants, and they're less likely to think in terms of NPV and IRR. Now, moving on down, we have the payback method. And we see it is used less frequently at large firms and more frequently at small firms. In fact, it's used almost as often as NPV and IRR. Remember back to our argument that smaller firms were more likely to have smaller projects? Yeah. Where did we say that payback kind of shines? Small, simple projects, right? And so these firms, they might not even have a good financial reason to do NPV. It might be a very small, simple project, and therefore they're going to use payback. At large companies, it's less likely because it's larger projects. And the other thing, we said that payback was good for firms with scarce capital. The larger firms are probably going to have more access to funds. Now, there are exceptions. I told you about my own company that I worked at. It was a Fortune 500 company, and we were kind of shut out of the capital markets because we had behaved so badly over the years. Well, that's when we trotted out payback. Then we have discounted payback. Oh my goodness, that dog with fleas, that meatloaf, just forget about it. Accounting rate of return. Large firms, 1.25, small firms, 1.41. Why more often at small firms? Because the top financial thinker is more likely to be an accountant, right? And then finally, we have the Profitability Index. And you say, wow, Profitability Index gets used half as often as discounted payback, and we know that discounted payback is basically dog vomit. Why this thing must really suck? And the answer is not really. Let's think this through. We said that Profitability Index was really good in times of capital scarcity. And the good thing that we know about U.S. capital markets is if you've got a good idea, you typically can get funding for it. And so Profitability Index doesn't get used all that often because we don't see all that much capital rationing. We don't see all that much. Now, I was given this talk to a regular MBA class, and all the Americans are shaking their heads, and there was this girl sitting here. She was from Vietnam, and she is shaking her head like this. And I asked her, I said, what's wrong? She says, absolutely not. She says, it's really hard to get capital. And I asked her, are you talking about in your country or in ours? And she said, in my country. And I said, here's the deal. First of all, they don't have well-developed capital markets in Vietnam. I don't know if you knew that. But secondly, therefore, where do people tend to have to go to get money to do stuff? They have to go to the bank, right? They have to go to the bank. Here's what you need to know about the banks in Vietnam. They're owned by the government. Now, there are two kinds of businesses in Vietnam. There are private businesses and there are state-owned enterprises. You are the loan officer at the government bank. You've got 1 billion dong or whatever it is they use in Vietnam. I think it's dong. Okay, 1 billion dong you can loan out. And you've got a private enterprise over here asking for 1 billion dong, and you've got a state-owned enterprise over here asking for 1 billion dong. Who do you loan to? Yeah, you lend to the state for a couple of reasons. Number one, we work for the same boss, right? And number two, there is an implicit guarantee that the state-owned enterprise will pay its debts. Does that make sense? It's kind of like in the United States. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority. They own all these electrical plants, and they can borrow at cheaper rates than other utility firms simply because they have the implicit backing of the United States government. Does that make sense? And so it makes perfect sense for her, if she went back to Vietnam, that she would probably want to use Profitability Index far more than we would here in the United States, and it simply boils down to the fact that they don't have well-developed capital markets. Questions? Okay, I think that is the end of Chapter 7. Now, you guys were supposed to have some questions that you wanted to ask me to work out on the board for you. And usually Ms. Griffin has some. Do you have some today?
Not on the practice, that one was fine, but number 9 on the homework,
Okay.
that one was just, I don't know.
Okay.
I probably understand it now that you finished the lecture.
Okay.
Same
well,
with number 10, but
Number 9 or number 10?
both.
Both, okay.
Number 10's a calculation, but I think that was Profitability Index, and now I could probably.
Okay. Well, does anyone else have stuff they want to look at? See, I figured you were the only one that actually taken a look, so here we go. Okay, you are considering an investment with the following cash flows. If the required return on this investment is 13.5%, should you accept it based solely on the internal rate of return rule? Why or why not? Let's take a look at these cash flows. The first one is negative. And then we've got positive, positive, but what about year 3?
Now I get it.
Negative. And so, you know I gotta finish, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so what kind of cash flows would we call these? Unconventional or non-conventional? And so we know that IRR can lead to bad decisions. What rule should we be using for the set of cash flows? NPV. Okay, now, number 10. What's the profitability index for an investment with the following cash flows given a 9% required return? Let's go really basic here. What's the first thing I should do with my calculator?
Cash flows.
CS, second, clear work. What do I put in for CF0? Yeah, 21,500 negative, enter, arrow down. What do I put in for C01? Yeah, 7,400, enter, arrow down. What do I put for F01? 1. C02, 9,800, enter. What's F02? Still just 1, right? Because these things don't repeat. Arrow down, C03, 8,900, enter. Now I don't even have to worry about F03 because it's by default 1, so I'm not even going to mess with it. Now, what would be my next step? Yeah, we're going to calculate the NPV. So we're going to say NPV, what do I put in for I? 9, enter, arrow down, compute. So I'm getting $409.89. What's the next step to figure the profitability index? Yeah, and it's got to be positive, right? And then we're going to add 1. So I'm getting 1.02. Were you getting 0.98?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
I understand that.
Okay,
After
good,
the
good, good.
lecture.
Okay, any other questions that you want me to work through?
Yeah.
Any questions you want me to work through?
This printed.
You know what? I'm willing to call it quits if you guys are. I would. You want to go? Okay. And that's perfectly fine.